So on today's Unpacked episode, we're going global with a look at government finances. From the US to France to the UK, the dreaded deficits are growing. The debt is ballooning, and it's not just the faint-hearted who are beginning to get spooked. We ask the question, what's the most dangerous job to have in government? Well, the answer might surprise you, as a terror to match Robespierre's revolutionary reign has gripped civil servants the world over. And we've the very latest insight into what's happening in the local economy. Stay tuned. Hello and welcome to Trading Up Unpacked with me, Jim Fitzpatrick.
And I'm Richard Ramsey.
From Queen's Business School, Professor Richard Ramsey, no less. This is the Business and Entrepreneurship podcast from the Irish News, produced in association with EY. Richard, thanks a million for joining us. We've loads to unpack today, but can we start with government debt? There's ours in the UK, there's the French who are having a bit of a mare, and indeed even the Americans who've always had a lot of debt, but now people are starting to ask questions about it. So, I mean, we'll come to this bit later on, I think, because we both remember quite keenly, I think, I was reporting for the BBC, you were working for the bank at the time of the big sort of financial crisis, and all of that meant we're not there at the moment, but people are starting to look at debt again in a way that maybe they haven't done for the last few years. So let's start off with the Americans. Donald Trump had his big tax bill. He's given away a lot of goodies to the rich. He hasn't quite worked out how to pay for that, except he thinks maybe tariffs will do the job. So the tariffs are raising money at the moment, and that might sort of balance the books a bit, but the debt is still ballooning, yeah?
Yeah, that's right. And since the Trump's one big beautiful bill of the kind of tax cuts,
that's actually what he called it.
Yeah, he did.
It's literally its name.
It's not a checked joke. That's what in legislation it is written down as that. Mm-hmm. And since that was passed, the US deficit's actually notched up by $1 trillion.
$1 trillion. That's quite a few zeros. Then,
quite a few zeros, and that takes the overall. So that's the deficit. So that would be for the current financial year, and if you add that to all the other existing debt, you're just over $37 trillion. And I know sort of Dr. Evil on Austin Powers, that would be that would even surprise him, the scale of that one. So yes, so the issue with the tariffs. So yes, he was then looking for what Trump's after is then the revenue from the tariffs is then going to then offset and help pay down the deficit. That's a plan. Although we've then heard recently that the tariffs that he's implemented are illegal. So we wait to see how that plays out. So again, more uncertainty with that. But what is happening with government debt? It's the ongoing concerns, particularly in terms of how Trump is dealing with institutions, be it in terms of statisticians, be it in terms of the central bank and putting pressure on there, that these independent institutions kind of everywhere across the US are under pressure. And that's why you've been seeing in terms of financial markets, the bond markets, the sovereign debt markets, they've been seeing the interest rates starting to rise in government debt because financial markets are becoming a bit more kind of concerned of what Trump is at. And again, even in financial markets, you're seeing in terms of gold, the price of gold, and gold is traditionally rises whenever there's concerns of inflation and uncertainty. And we've seen that hit record highs over $3,600 lately.
Yeah, I mean, and it's all tied into the dollar. People talk about the mighty dollar because it has been generally so strong, but we're seeing a bit of a weakening there, and just psychologically, perhaps people asking the question is: can we be sure about the dollar? Do we want to leave our money in dollars? And that also, therefore, means, do we want to buy US government debt, which is effectively what that is? And if people stop buying US government debt, that's a crisis such as we haven't seen before.
Yeah, because if you look at then government debt, US treasuries are the safest of safe financial assets, and in many ways, a lot of financial assets the world over are kind of priced off that. So if you then have your anchor dislodged in terms of the US Treasury debt, how, the repercussions of how that is going to then go like a kind of domino through other assets.
Yeah, and as I say, we saw that happen with the European countries and others during the financial crisis. Ireland, of course, required a bailout whenever it couldn't, if you like, fund its own way, and it needed the IMF and the European Commission, European Central Bank to come in and bail it out. There's nobody really there of scale who could do that for the US. Now, I know we're really speculating way out here. We're not talking about a scenario like that, but even just the very fact that people are starting to question whether the US can service its debt is a slightly scary one.
Yeah, and as you were talking about the weakening of the dollar, so what we've seen so far this year, it's been the dollar when it's measured against a basket of currencies, which would be the likes of the euro, Japanese yen, sterling, etc. It's fallen by about 10%, and that's not what Trump and his advisors would have been expecting. So that means the tariffs, the fact that the dollar is going down, and if US consumers are going to face increased costs from the tariffs on manufactured goods, that's going to be a kind of double whammy for them. So there's the cost of the tariff and there's the weaker currency. And so that is something Trump hasn't really bargained for. And even though the US economy has, until I'd say relatively recently, has been largely booming, it has still got the deficit keeps on growing, and that shouldn't be happening. And what that is partially it's due to the legacy of the COVID spending, which was the US threw a lot more money at the problem than the likes of the UK and the Eurozone, but that is still in the system, and part of that is the problem of why debts are mounting, not just in the US, but the legacy of COVID is seen in the government balance sheets of UK and Europe. Yeah,
we're feeling it all around the place. And again, just to sort of clarify when we talk about deficits and debt, so the deficit is essentially, if you think about it as a business, it's your kind of annual spending, how much you spend versus how much you take in. So when we talk about the US deficit, we're talking about a recurring mismatch between what they're raising in terms of revenue and what they're spending. And that's growing and growing and growing. And then that gets added to the longer term sort of government debt. And that's how those two things are connected. So yeah, we can see as well then a bit of, we've got wobbles in Europe as well. So France, as we're speaking, I think the French Prime Minister has been to resign, offers resignation to the president. So France will have its third Prime Minister in 2 years. They've just been through one before that. They had Michel Barnier, well known to people in this part of the world because of his negotiations.
3 months, I think he lasted.
3 months as a Prime Minister, kind of almost Liz Truss territory there.
It's, everybody's getting a go in France these days.
Absolutely. So Barnier had a go. He wasn't able to hang on in there. Despite his success as the kind of, if you like, almost boring Brexit negotiator on behalf of Europe, I think maybe that's why Macron put him in, thinking he could do the boring job of settling nerves in France. He just couldn't resolve the issues they face. So they've lost a prime minister, and again, it's very much related to their own ongoing deficit issues, an attempt to try and balance the books, and maybe no political solution for doing that.
Yeah, that's right. And their deficit, they were trying to, what the French Prime Minister was trying to pass was then kind of budget measures to try and get their deficit down from, I think it was about 5.6% of GDP down to about 4.5% by next year. And just for a rule of thumb, remember that whenever countries were joining the Eurozone, that it was 3% was the kind of measure. 3% deficit should have been 3% of GDP was what they were looking for as a target. And then overall stock of debt was 60%. And both those kind of speed limits have been exceeded. But the concern, and I suppose if you think of big picture here, is remember when back in the days of COVID, when governments were throwing off debt and we had help out to eat out and come up with any scheme and there was money for it. Back then, interest rates were on the floor. And so that cost of debt was then going to be was relatively cheap. And those were, at that time, that's when governments should have been maybe locking in with 10, 20, 30-year debts when it was really, really low. But that was a freak period of low interest rates, which we became accustomed to for about a decade or so. And now the fact that interest rates are back, the likes of the Federal Reserve, then it's between 4.25% and 4.5% for its benchmark rate. And in the UK, you're looking at 4%. It's that cost of those interest rates for the specific rates for government debt is now led to a significant increase in debt repayments. So it's not just the debt, it's in the interest payments have rocketed. And in the likes of France, France debt interest payments are now larger than the likes of what they would spend on defence or what they would spend on education. So that's what the concern is, and how do you actually change that? And in many respects, when we think the old adage about you didn't fix the roof when the sun was shining, when interest rates were on the floor, the central banks were helping out to make life easier for governments in their fiscal policy. And in many ways, there should have been, at that time, changes, reforms, all those kind of tough decisions made. But that's the sun's gone away. The interest rates have then risen considerably. And we didn't fix a house while the sun was shining.
It's raining heavily, and we've got a leaky roof. Basically, is what you're saying.
Yeah, and the French are going to have a national strike tomorrow.
Yeah, well, I mean, the French love a good strike. Kind of burn a few things while they're at it, no doubt. But and the UK has its own issues as well. I mean, you're mentioning those sort of figures about servicing the debt, and I think that's where you do see the real difference. It's not just on the actual amount of debt or the actual amount that's there. It's the cost of servicing that debt, which is where we've seen the huge growth because of just those 1 or 2 percentage points in interest rates. We're talking about from a position of next to nothing, you're talking about a doubling of the cost. And somebody quoted stats to me the other day, well-informed person, so I assume they knew what they were talking about, and they said that sort of pre-COVID, the cost of servicing the UK debt was about half the defence budget. Today, it's twice the defence budget. It's that kind of comparison. So you can really see how the Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, has got a difficult task ahead of her when she's looking towards the budget and what can she do? Where can she find more money? How can she balance the books when she's just so much money's gone out the door just to pay for the interest on the debt?
And I think that's just what the general public, they kind of miss that. It is that fact. And if debt interest was a department, it's after health and I think education, it's below education. It would be like the third biggest department. And if people were wondering how come we're spending, there's more public spending as a percentage of GDP than we've had, apart from COVID, than we've had for probably since the 1970s. Where's it all going? Debt interest. That's where a huge amount is going to. And the opportunity cost of that is that can't go to health to improve waiting lists. It can't go for education, or it can't go for, in terms of things like police and Home Office and stopping the boats.
Yeah, and that's really it's a huge political conundrum. That it's a big challenge for a government that's come to power. And if we think back to New Labour and the circumstances in which they assumed power, they did have a radical kind of constitutional agenda about devolution, not just in Northern Ireland, but obviously what was happening in Scotland and Wales. They had changes that they could point to after a year or so in office. They had
made Bank of England independent for the first time.
So I mean, that in a sense, it was kind of a first day thing by Gordon Brown, but it kind of was so radical in a sense. It was, he didn't almost need to do anything else as Chancellor to have done that. That was a huge thing to have done. So, as I say, when you think back to New Labour, a year after they'd taken charge, you could point to all of these things. But and we can't really say that about the current lot. But to be fair to them, New Labour had probably a much nicer economic inheritance. John Major and co had done the hard work, and they were picking up as the economy was starting to lift, and they had plenty of money to play with.
Yeah, the 99 the 97 election was the one to win because it was going to be, well, the Conservatives had been in for such a long time and they were jaded and all the kind of expenses, scandals and all of that kind of stuff. But the public finances were improving, the economy was recovering, and that was the time for, Labour to come in, whereas the election that they won last year wasn't the one to win. We knew whoever was going to get it, the public finances were going to be terrible. We probably underestimated how the changes in the geopolitical setup has deteriorated further. But yes, but I think the problem is when you look back over the last 12 months or so, what has been achieved, and in many ways, a lot of when we think of dealing with the public finances or fiscal policy, what financial markets want to see is credibility, trust. And when we've seen in UK, there's been U-turns with the winter fuel payments for pensioners. Then there's the U-turn on some of the welfare things. That kind of trust and credibility has largely gone. And then, as recently as this week, we have had the kind of the housing minister and deputy prime minister then engaged in terms of the kind of tax scandal and not paying the appropriate stamp duty that she should have paid. We're not in a good place, and as the budget on the 26th of November beckons, things are going to get tougher.
Yeah, and the funny thing about the budget is, despite that's a really late date for a budget, isn't it?
It's as late as probably they possibly could. And
yeah, so that's kind of coming back to the old thing. Is it Mr. McColber used to say, something will turn up or whatever? Is that hopeful? Kind of maybe if we just keep delaying it, something better will happen. Maybe something will improve. It'll give us some more wiggle room.
I think there's an element of that. There's also probably thinking, when is the Bank of England going to potentially cut interest rates, and that would be in November. So at least there would be that. Whether the Bank of England is then going to even slow down on its what is called its quantitative tightening, which is one of the reasons behind, which is the reverse of quantitative easing, where you print lots of money. It's actually when the assets they're trying to reduce or trying to release the gilts that they bought during COVID back onto the market. That causes the interest rates for government borrowing to rise. They might change that as well, which Rachel Reeves would love them to do that. But overall, I think it's then a combination of those factors. And will it be, it's just going to look better then than it would be now. And remember the OBR, the Office for Budget Responsibility, I think it needs 10 weeks to then sort of plan for this. And but as we'll maybe talk about later in terms of how it forecasts with the quality of the statistics that it currently has, is a concern for Rachel Reeves' budgetary projections as well.
Yeah, interesting, of course, and I suppose it was never on the cards. But given this unexpected reshuffle that Keir Starmer had, and quite a radical one, given that he lost Angela Rayner, and then rather than just replacing her, he kind of moved everybody around, bar, of course, Rachel Reeves. So despite any earlier wobbles, it's clear that she's secure for now anyway in that role. And when we think about the economy and what she did, with her first budget, speaking to people in business, the message I've been getting anyway, talking to people in business, whether they're small business, big business, or representatives thereof, is there ain't anything here for her. Go away, Rachel. You've got your money. Yeah. You've slapped us with the national insurance changes. You've done all the other stuff, and we don't have anything left for you. And do you think that message? I mean, that's clearly what business is saying. But do you think that message has been taken to heart by government? Do you think they are going to leave business alone this time and try and find other areas?
My gut is they will leave business alone. And supposedly they're the government for growth. And although we got the surprise with employers' national insurance contributions last time round, I do think they will focus on other things, whether it's on pensions, whether it's on just kind of households in general. I think what they should be doing is they should be they obviously rue the day that they had in their manifesto that they weren't going to change national insurance in terms of for employees, VAT and income tax. I'm sure. Well, it's whether they end up saying that this is now extraordinary times, and we do have to increase income tax by 1 or 2 pence in the pound. That would actually be kind of easier in terms of bringing in guaranteed income rather than what they're trying to do at the minute. But I think I think areas which could be vulnerable would be like pensions tax relief, where currently, depending on what your income threshold is, you could be getting 45% or 40% tax relief, putting money into pensions, where I could quite conceivably see them reducing that to 30% and selling it as those lower rate taxpayers are actually, we're going to provide you with more tax relief. The only problem is they probably don't have the money and financial wherewithal to do that. But I think they're going to look at areas like that. And it's interesting, and a lot of the reshuffles, what we saw was Torsten Bell, who used to be chief executive of the Resolution Foundation, a left-leaning think tank. So when he left the Resolution Foundation, he was quickly given a safe Labour seat. I think he was maybe special advisor to Alistair Darling or somebody back in the day. Mm-hmm. But so he's now been drafted in. He's then pensions minister. He's fast-tracked to pensions minister, and then he's now been brought in on this budget. But I think some of the centre-right or right-wing newspapers are then worried about, and they've been running stories of how Torsten Bell, the man from the left, and he's going to...
And of course, because he was with the Resolution Foundation, they can go back and look at anything they've ever done and said, look at what he's thinking.
So then there was all the issues. You were hearing things like having national insurance contributions added to rent income. So
yes,
if you're a landlord
yeah,
and stuff like that, which would be, I can't see that happen, because that would be, there's already a housing shortage in the private rental sector, UK, Northern Ireland.
So you're with Kirsty Allsop, and that when I saw her, whenever Kirsty Allsop comes on the radio to say, this is madness.
Baldrick, I think she said...
Is that what you say? It was like an idea from Baldrick, yeah, worthy of Baldrick, yeah.
Worthy of Baldrick. So
yeah, I mean, and Kirsty's got some, she's got power with Middle England, I would say, a kind of clout.
So I don't think that will happen. And then other talk of whether they're going to then introduce on your primary residence stamp duty as well, which would seem an easy pickings for all the kind of huge house price equity that's occurred over the last 10, 20 years, that people sell a house, get a proportion of that. What's not to like, some left-wingers would say, but then the issue is that would just then stop people wanting to move. And one of the problems is the whole getting the housing chain going and getting people to move, or even people to trade down. They won't do that if they're then having to pay a tax like that. So I can't see that coming in. But what we really need is reforms in terms of in the UK is on like sort of council tax, and they talk about this whole having a land value tax, and because they talk about some of the council tax, which is equivalent to our rates here in Northern Ireland, in some wealthy parts of London is actually lower than for certain houses is lower than what the equivalent would be in the north of England. So sort of changes need to be done there. But it's what Rachel Reeves has done is she's left this huge gap now of speculation over the Halloween and into the up until Christmas on what she's going to tax, and that could hit confidence like it did last summer.
Yeah, so the kites will be flying over the next few weeks as certain policies are tested out. I mean, just the interesting thing about the whole property side of things is, as you were saying there, one of the proposals, that seems, let's call it a kite flying exercise at the moment, is to tax people when they sell their house as opposed to when they're buying a house. But that will have other unintended or consequences, as you say, because it might put people off selling their homes and therefore slow up the whole kind of housing chain. But we are talking about taxing at the margins here, aren't we? And as you say, much easier. Yes. The situation that the government faces, given the scale of the debt repayments that it has and the cost of the interest on that debt, it would be so much easier if it was back to the traditional 1p, 2p on the basic rate of income tax or whatever. That would raise the money.
Absolutely.
They could pay the bills and promise to cut it again.
And I don't think there would be that much kickback, other than that they would say it's, I suppose it's trust again, and it would be you had it in your manifesto. But, should the political parties not be putting country ahead of manifestos?
Well, that would be a first. That would be a first. Well, look, we're talking about difficult decisions. But obviously, if you're in politics, one thing you need to take any decision is good information. I mean, that's the same in business. Talk to anybody in business now. It's all about data. People want the best data on our customers. We want to know what it is. We don't want anybody to corrupt that data. We want to be able to interrogate it. We want to be able to then respond to the customer's needs. And that's how you'd think it should be in government as well. But funny enough, it ain't like that. If we were saying at the start there, I mean, perhaps the most dangerous job around these days is some kind of official statistician.
Yes.
Look at what happened. What did Trump do? Was it the person who was the head of the Bureau of Labor Statistics in the US? Got the boot.
That would be the equivalent of ONS, Office of National Statistics in the UK.
So they're bringing out the jobs figures, payroll figures and so on in the States. And they, a bit like here, they revise them as well, depending on updated data as it comes through the following month. Trump didn't like the figures and just sacked the head of the organisation.
Yes, because he didn't like, so it's monthly figures, employment figures, which are called non-farm payrolls, which would be probably it is the one monthly statistic which is in financial markets, which financial markets pay the most attention to. And yes, there are always revisions. So you would get the monthly figures, then there would be revisions where it would maybe go back. But the revisions which went back to whenever Trump had then been inaugurated was then showing that the job gains that previously were being signalled, it wasn't job gains, and there was even job losses. Or so the net result is, since the Trump economy has come into view since January of this year, it hasn't created it's created hardly any jobs, and there's concerns in that. Trump didn't like that. He thought that Erica McIntarfer, if I'm pronouncing that right. Apologies to any McIntarfers out there if I'm not.
They come from North Antrim, I think.
But so he didn't like the look. He thought she was manipulating the statistics. So this would be the head of a massive organisation, that she was being manipulating the statistics to make him look bad. And so she's out, and the person that he's appointed was actually photographed. I think his name's E.J. Antoni. He's the new pick for that Bureau of Labour Market Statistics post. He was pictured on the 6th of January in Capitol Hill 2021 with the insurgents. With the insurgents. I think he was maybe just like trying to maybe count them or seasonally adjust to see how many were there, but he wasn't the guy with the horns on his head.
Well, that's good, because apparently he's useless. His numbers work isn't great. So effectively what we're saying here is a political appointee, another Trump acolyte, put into a key position where, I mean, it's not just, let's face it, it's not just the American government that wants these statistics to be sound and secure.
Yep.
But as you say, everybody else watches them. The rest of the world watches them.
Yeah. And then the figure since Erica was sacked, the replacement, so there was worse than expected jobs figures with that non-farm payrolls on last Friday. So what are they going to do? Is it almost like just a kind of try and intimidate independent institutions to come up with better numbers, or and the problem is, what if that goes to inflation? Because the Bureau of Labour Market Statistics, they calculate the CPI, the inflation figures. So what are they going to do there? Do they start then saying, instead of, and inflation is a concern with the Federal Reserve at the minute, are they going to say, oh no, they sort of change them and come out with lower ones? And again, as we mentioned at the start, the Treasury, US Treasury debt or assets are the kind of like anchor of financial market assets around the world. Some of them are index linked to inflation. And if your measure of inflation is dodgy or you make it up and it doesn't mean anything, that just then will spread to all throughout. And you think of then China and how many, the huge stock of treasury assets that it has, and if any of those are inflation linked, it just, the whole system then just, the financial markets and financial market world as we know it just starts to break down.
I mean, who knew statisticians were so important? I'll tell you my joke about, do you know the difference between a statistician and a mathematician, and how you can tell the difference between them if you meet them at a party?
No.
Well, I'm sorry to inflict this upon you. Anyway, so the mathematician is the one staring at their shoes, whereas the statistician is the one staring at your shoes. Okay, so there you are. That's one for the nerds out there. But obviously, who knew that a statistician could be so important? But I mean, it is like sort of pulling at the threads of the fundamentals, isn't it? Once you start sort of unpicking the stuff that we've just taken for granted, that we can rely on these figures. And if you can't rely on the US payroll figures, then can you rely on the inflation figures? Can you rely on the economic decisions they're taking? Can you invest money in that country? Can you buy its debt? As you say, the ripple effects could be huge.
And then hence that's why you're seeing like the gold price surge, because people are then concerned about the pressure that Trump is putting on institutions, not least in terms of the Federal Reserve and central banks, and challenging the kind of orthodoxy which in the likes of monetary policy has been independent central banking. And he has, with another sacking of Lisa Cook, who was a Fed governor, first female black governor appointed by Joe Biden, and she's been sacked by Trump because of alleged mortgage fraud. And even though she hasn't had a case put in front of her or anything like that, that's kind of what's happened there, and it's all legal challenges. And she's
So currently the suggestion is the president can theoretically sack someone for cause, and the cause needs to be fairly substantial. So he's come up with this idea that she's been involved in mortgage fraud. There have been some stories, but nothing confirmed. And meanwhile, she's challenging this. So is she sacked? Is she not? We don't know. But what it has...
She's got Hunter Biden's lawyer fighting for her.
Okay. But what it's done is...
And Jared Kushner's, actually.
Oh, really? Yes, that's right. Yes, the crossover there. But, I mean, there's the chilling effect of this is that even with all of that, Trump saying, well, look, within a short time, I'll have my majority, I'll have my people running the show.
And he's been open, quite transparent about that, And that's all because he wants interest rates cut. He wants them down to 1%. So they're currently within a range of 4.25% to 4.5%. He wants them, and I think it's the Fed's meeting later this week where it's probably going to cut them by at least 25 basis points, potentially 50. But then I think they'll maybe stop there. But Trump wants them to drop to 1%. And the reason for that goes back to what we were talking about at the beginning, is then the debt repayments, because if you then get the interest payments reduced down to 1%, basically Trump saying, forget about inflation, nothing to see here, just get the interest rates down. That will then make the big deficit, and whenever he has to renew the 37 trillion debt, or $37 trillion worth of debt, whenever that has to get renewed in installments over time, that it will be at a lower interest rate. So he's basically just wanting to politicize the central bank.
And as you say, ignore the fundamentals, but for the purposes of making things easier to service that debt interest. But what would be the consequences of that? Because if inflation runs riot and there's a confidence shock, even if the theoretical headline rate in servicing the debt is lower, you could still end up with a huge problem of government debt.
Yep, and like Chris Giles of the Financial Times was then quoting research over the last few weeks then in terms of central banks which were then facing pressure, political pressure, and those that yielded and sort of folded to that pressure, they ultimately have higher rates of inflation. And it's kind of ironic where one of the primary reasons how Donald Trump got elected last year, inaugurated this year, was due to inflationary pressures under the Biden regime, and he's actually going to, by his actions, will increase inflation.
And I mean, and that one thing we know is people do feel inflation. We've all experienced it, particularly with foodstuffs and things like that.
Yep.
People have noticed it, and it doesn't go away. Then I mean, once the prices are up, even if inflation comes down, that's obviously just the rate of increases going down. The actual prices never really deflate. So people experience it, and they don't forget about it. And if they were to experience another hike, similar to what happened post-COVID, politically, he'd feel that effect too.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. And then you have to feel for Jerome Powell, or Jay Powell, as he's known, the chairperson of the Federal Reserve, the equivalent of the Bank of England governor for the US Fed, where Donald Trump calls him on Truth Social on social media, calls him like total loser, numbskull, moron. It's like, imagine if Donald Trump or you had somebody calling you that all the time, and just
that person was theoretically my boss in a sort of disconnected kind of way. Yeah,
and that's going on sort of constantly.
Yeah, it wouldn't be great for his self-confidence. Although I did like the way Powell is the only person I've seen to contradict Trump to his face in front of the cameras whenever Trump visited the Federal Reserve, and there's question marks of the cost of the building, the refurb, exactly. Yeah. And Trump pulls out of his pocket a piece of paper which says there's a whole new load of spending worth X billion over here. And Powell says, let me see that. And says, no, you've totally added it, a totally different building, nothing to do with us. And hands it back to him. Nobody ever really contradicts Trump, but Powell is actually, I suppose, one of these officials that can't be sacked, it seems, at the moment. But Trump's finding ways to work around him.
Although he's due to then, I think it's until May next year. So
he's on the way out anyway.
He's on the way out. And then that's what Trump is then arguably trying to then get. Can he get a majority of Trumpers, for want of a better word, in terms of on that committee? But there's still, in terms of the number of people who vote on the interest rates, there would be like 13. So he would still be short, even with Lisa Cook off and is getting his appointment on. He gets a majority of Fed governors, but they're only part of the wider group that actually does the interest rates.
Yeah, he doesn't get to appoint someone else.
But he'll be probably working on that in different ways.
Putting pressure on elsewhere. So, this whole thing about don't shoot the messenger, phrase that we use, I was looking it up, and it has kind of military connections because, back in the day, and going back to the ancients, there were these different codes if you were fighting a foreign army. And you didn't shoot the messenger because, it was the way to engage and maybe parley or discuss things. But we all remember from that the 300 film about the Spartans, how he kicked the poor guy, the Persian, down the well. And that apparently did happen, but the Spartans came to regret that because, they should have actually, engaged properly and not just sort of killed the messenger. Yeah. But here we have, as I say, this is a messenger from your own side we're talking about, coming, in this case, to Trump being sort of kicked down the well. It's kind of mad stuff. And then we move across the Atlantic to the UK, and we're not talking about political meddling here in the UK, but there is a bit of a crisis, and that's more to do with some concerns about how our statistics are being compiled and how credible they actually are.
Yeah, so there hasn't been firings as such, but there's been resignations with the Office of National Statistics. So there was the chief statistician or national statistician, Sir Ian Diamond. He stood down in May on ill health, and that just followed the start of a review into ONS statistics. And there's concerns like the Bank of England has been criticising the reliability of particularly the employment data and the labour force survey, which has lost its kite mark national statistics status in October 2023. So the quality's gone down. There was in the review they're highlighting weaknesses on in terms of budgeting, also in terms of staff morale. There was even then at the House of Commons one of the select committees which was looking at the quality of the national statistics, he referred to Syrian Diamond as a hybrid between a prince, a Medici prince, and Blofeld, the Bond villain. So
That's not what I expect. A description of a chief
statistician.
No, I can't even say that.
And apparently, you see, the thing is, it's where ONS did exceedingly well was during COVID, when you sort of think whenever there was, they still had to keep that operation running, and then they were introducing all the new surveys, whether it was even things for the furlough scheme, whether it was in the short-term indicators. They excelled at the new and innovating there, but it was at the expense of neglecting the kind of core economic statistics, and the quality of them has deteriorated. So the likes of the labour force survey, the respondents, survey respondents rate dropped to as low as 17%.
So basically, this is the survey they send out to try and get an accurate picture of the jobs market.
Yeah.
And if the response rate has dropped to that extent, then you start to worry about the quality of the data you're bringing in.
So then policymakers are flying blind, the likes of, and then how that feeds into the Office for Budget Responsibilities forecasts, Rachel Reeves' budget, all of the projections, if there's problems with the quality of the data. And it hasn't been just with the jobs data. There's been retail sales figures have been delayed, and there's been, it's not just the French ONS were on strike over reversal of one of the most generous working from home policies, where they had to then come in 2 days a week. But they were striking over that. But so,
sorry, hold on a second. So this is the statisticians striking over an insistence that they work in the office 2 days a week.
Yes.
Yeah. Mm. And as a proportion, you just ask them, what is the percentage of time we're asking you to work in the office? 2/5.
And then it's like, so morale has gone downhill in ONS, and then the other resignation was the kind of regulator of statistics, Sir Robert Choate, who's known for his prowess in public finances. He resigned. He was chair of that regulator since about 2022.
So, and he's of course connected with the Fiscal Council here in Northern Ireland. But was that a case, do you think, of him saying, he's there to oversee and try and make things better? Was it a case of, look, this is such a mess, I need out of here? Or what do you think was going on there?
I don't know about his own personal thoughts, but he probably would have... I think there was an element of then, he was in from 2022. They probably after they had the review, they need a new leader. And it was kind of like they need a new broom, both at chair and in terms of national statistician. And they've actually brought in a permanent secretary alongside an interim national statistician to try and change things. But it was maybe just, he maybe discovered it was maybe a poison chalice. And when you arrive and then after a period of time, you realise it might take a year or so until you ease into the thing, and then you realise that you've got Blofeld under your command.
Or the Medici prince. Well, fair play to him. He's still involved in the Northern Ireland Fiscal Council. So, I mean, the guy kind of likes a challenge. But yeah, so how many statisticians does it take to fix, I don't know, the ONS is the question?
Probably a lot more. But again, I suppose, like the US, one of the common themes with some of the problems with the statistical authorities worldwide has been the kind of budget cuts, and they've been hit with that, and the likes of ONS, in terms of some of the budget cuts that what we are seeing now. The review would say there's other issues, leadership, management issues, and budgetary planning, but the fact that they have had to deal with less money whenever they're getting involved in things, we're now starting to see the impact of that. Yeah, I mean, I vaguely remember doing statistics in maths at school. It actually was possibly, I think, the hardest element, or it was it's the sort of thing you think this should be straightforward, but once you get into really trying, and you would do it obviously as daily as part of your job, to actually use statistics properly, to understand them properly, it's not a straightforward exercise. And you can understand why it needs really good people and investment. But perhaps the politicians are thinking here, why don't we just get ChatGPT to do it? It could make up the answers for you whenever it doesn't have the information to hand, Yeah, but I think it's the fact that there's these things which we have taken for granted for so long, whether it's central bank independence, whether it's statistics that you can rely on and you get decent response rates. Because remember, with COVID, one of the issues was because of COVID, who was going to respond to a letter or who was going to respond to a sort of phone call to fill these out. And the surveys are being revamped. And I suppose the good news is a more reliable survey for the labour market is coming to a statistical office near you soon, and that will happen in Northern Ireland with NISRA as well next year.
Okay, so we can look forward to that. And I suppose just a quick reflection. We were talking about the financial crisis and that period. You were working at that stage for the Ulster Bank, part of the RBS group, which of course was at the time ultimately became nationalised. So you must have had pressure internally from the bank to say, well, let's not spell out how bad the economy is, because they were having to deal with all of that over here. And I do remember specifically, because that was probably more what I was reporting on, which was the kind of wider economy and, local politicians and others who didn't like maybe people like you and others standing up and telling it as it was, because it didn't fit with the narrative they wanted to tell. Do you remember any sort of pressure at that time?
Yeah, lots of pressure. So I joined the bank in the end of March 2007. So that was just in time to get my feet under the table for the...
And you'd come from government, yeah?
Civil service, yeah. So it was then from DETI, as it was, Department, I suppose, largely Department for the Economy as it is now. So yeah, I came for the bright lights of banking and all of that.
Ended up back in government again by default.
Yeah. So well, only about 93% of me or something.
Oh, yeah. Your percentage of you was publicly owned, yeah.
Yeah. But yeah, so there was two things. So there was the global financial crisis, credit crunch, and that kind of came later. But it was like straight away I was in the hothouse, which was the property market and the property boom, which ended up being the UK's most significant residential property boom and bust that's ever happened. And unfortunately, I came in at that time, and part of my role, where I was managed out of Dublin, was to tell it as it is, what was happening in the economy. And because their belief was in Northern Ireland, there wasn't that kind of independent voice, that it was all people weren't giving a true picture of what was going on. The only problem with that was I was being sort of encouraged to tell it as it is, but then I was working around people on the property side, both in terms of business, corporate, and then obviously retail and mortgages. So I wasn't too popular there, and it was intense pressure. There was times that I didn't know at the time. I knew later that there was a lot of the staff around me were brought into a room and spoken to by senior people saying that customers are complaining about the economist and all of this kind of thing. But it was then at a chief executive level for Ulster Bank, they were saying, no, we want you to do this, because ultimately they don't want me to be shouting it from the rooftops on a regular basis. But there were times when you had to come out and they were saying defend credibility and all of this. You had to come out, but because ultimately you had one person, if you talk up the housing market, you're penalising those people who are buying a house. And if you talk down the market, you're penalising the house builders or people trying to sell a house. So the only way was you just have to then tell it as it is, and you sort of like try and navigate that. But
it's straight. So just as well that you had those senior people, you had your back in a sense, but there also was political pressure. Politicians saying, these negative commentators, because everybody, let's face it, anybody that had a few quid and maybe invested in property, everybody thought, well, hey, the good times are here. Let's just enjoy it. Nobody wanted to consider that.
I did get, there were house builders I would have got grief from face-to-face. I would have got estate agents. I wasn't very popular. And then I suppose politicians as well, because then it was even at the time there was talk of recession, and that was like Northern Ireland didn't do recession. Doesn't do recessions, and people were then saying and advising government that no, we don't have a huge banking sector and financial sector, so we won't be exposed. But the problem with Northern Ireland was it was exposed through property, and it was exposed through the Celtic Tiger and the links with the South and all of that. It was massive exposure. And the kind of clue for me because I was able to do a back of an envelope kind of calculation, it was basically to show how we're going to be in recession relative to all the sophisticated economic models which were saying we wouldn't, was there was effectively a military field hospital of distressed property clients had set up beside where I was kind of seated. So you could kind of work out all the pain and issues which were coming in there. And I was able to think, if house building, even though construction is only a relatively small part of the economy, house building is half of that. But if house building effectively stops, that is going to cause a recession, and it's going to. So that's kind of what I did and how I knew it was going to be there. But it was a lot of pressure, and I can remember then it was even we had the credit crunch. That was in the September 2008. And we were going up as a bank and then briefing and doing presentations to all the political parties in Stormont. And I was kind of challenged about being too negative about recession. And they were telling me respected economists say we're not going to go into recession. And
that meant you weren't respected.
Yeah, that's what I took it from it. And then I can remember I think it was that night, it was like Lehman's went down, or there was something like that, and it was almost it was kind of surreal, because I was kind of almost like cheering. I was going, I told you how
proven
bad
right, but sometimes the circumstances. Yeah,
but I had to sort of like keep that quiet. But yeah, so that was and it was at the time there was a lack of statistics. So was one of the issues where we didn't have like a quarterly GDP measure. That didn't exist. We had various other indices. We didn't actually have official Northern Ireland NISRA house price, residential property price stats, which was probably a good job, because it was the house prices increased by doubled in the course of 18 months from the first quarter of 2005. And then residential property transactions, we didn't have those figures at the time, but then they now reveal you saw like a 60-odd% drop in property transactions. So, but what I was relying on was a kind of trusty PMI survey, which people thought wasn't kind of telling the truth. But one of the problems, because we sponsored it at the bank and I was to be spokesperson for that, and I had to go out every month then saying what it was showing. And it was actually for 67 months, which is then 67 months, so 5.5 years. There was no growth in this survey.
Dr. Doom for 5.5 years.
And I had to
face of economic death.
I had to look at the thesaurus for alternative ways of saying things weren't growing and and trying to how I could change it. But that was the unfortunate thing. And then the issue...
Arlene Fossig was the economy minister for a time during that. Did she have your picture on a dartboard, do you think? Or people like that, possibly?
I think my face wouldn't have been recognised.
The number of darts in it? Probably a couple of little sort of voodoo dolls as well, yeah.
But I suppose then that would have been the case maybe in Trump world, that survey would have been stopped. Mm-hmm. And indeed, that's one of the things that we're seeing in terms of some of the negative data, and that Wall Street Journal has been saying that there's a lot of Chinese data, economic data statistics is now being kind of withdrawn and stuff. But it would have been stop the PMI. We don't like it. The bank could have said stop sponsoring it. It's not good news. We only want good news. But then that's the problem, is people want to know what world they're operating in, not the world we'd like to be in. But it's, you have to know what's going on. And so that was... I
suppose the what this tells us is that you have a certain amount of empathy with these statisticians and kind of leaders in places like the Reserve, the pressure that you can come in under to kind of bend the truth. But sticking to it ultimately is better for everybody, even if you don't like it at the time. And I suppose just to kind of round off, you mentioned the PMI survey. Talking about Northern Ireland then, if we were to look at what the hard data tells us at the moment, as we look ahead to the budget and everything else, obviously the executive doesn't have to make any decisions in terms of raising taxes, and it has avoided those that it could make, such as water charges. But what does the data tell us at the moment about the local economy?
So it's hot off the press, the Purchasing Managers Index from Ulster Bank. It's for the month of August. It was business activity contracted So that's private sector activity contracted, and it's fallen in 8 of the last 9 months. New orders have fallen. Employment is still growing. But so we are seeing kind of weakness on that, and currently it's the likes of manufacturing saw the steepest declines in business activity last month.
So the picture's a little bit troubled locally, but does that fit in with what's happening across the UK, do you think, at the moment?
Some of the UK figures seem to be a bit stronger, but then it seems to be we're in this kind of limbo land waiting for Rachel Reeves on the tax front and what's going to happen in the budget.
Yep, and I suppose we're waiting to see what happens with Trump's tariffs, if they survive, what their longer term impact is, and that's a huge change in global trade and how that might filter down into everything else, manufacturing across the world, etc.
But as difficult that being an economist or a statistician is, it's not as bad as it could be much worse, because it was Tim Hartford in one of his Financial Times columns recently on the back of the US statistician getting sacked, was saying that it could be worse, that there was a Russian or a statistician, Olympii Kvitkin, who produced disappointing figures in 1937 for the Soviet Union census, and Joseph Stalin had him shot.
Oh,
so the messenger was shot. So at least it's not as bad as that here. And
that was
getting a P45 is.
Yeah, old Joe Stalin wasn't exactly one for kind of reasoned argument. So yeah, well, Trump hasn't quite got to that stage yet, nor indeed has anybody on this side of the Atlantic, thankfully. So listen, Richard, thanks a million. You're safe here. This is your safe space. You can come and say what you like here. We're all ears to hear it. So join us again in a couple of weeks on Unpack. But thanks for joining us today. You've been listening to Trading Up, the business and entrepreneurship podcast from the Irish News, presented by me, Jim Fitzpatrick, and produced in association with EY.